So I'm making this video because I was looking back and I saw that I had made a bunch of videos for the different formats and the different organizations of debate, but it had been quite a while since I'd done anything at all for people who just do individual events. So I went back to the file of ideas that I built up over the year, and I thought I would share with you some of the possibilities that I see that I think would be kind of fruitful for platform speech topics. And I know that there's kind of a shuffling of the different categories going on, and there are new events being created with new rules. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to divide these ideas into informative speech possibilities and persuasive speech possibilities, and then you can figure out which event they would work for. So the first informative speech possibility, if I were you, I would go looking for writings about a researcher by the name of John Ioannidis. Now, John Ioannidis is the head of the Prevention Research Center at the Stanford Medical School, and he has made, in the past couple of years, some sweeping critiques of how medical research is conducted and published. And in particular, he says there's a bias in favor of publishing positive results, and that negative results, things that show that a particular medical intervention is not effective or that there's no connection, that those aren't published. And the way research works, if you have a trial that shows an effect, you need to contextualize it against other people conducting the same trial. That's called replication. And he's saying because we're not publishing the negative studies that show no effect, we're winding up with a lot of very inflated findings. We're winding up believing that we've discovered something important when actually the effect is not nearly as strong as we think it might be. And there are some serious implications to this. A lot of people, maybe someone in your family, have been prescribed medications called statins for their heart disease, and his review of the research and his looking into some of the negative findings that were never published, he says in most of those cases those statins aren't doing any good at all. He's also found that a lot of people take vitamin D supplements, that we sell almost $500 million a year in vitamin D supplements, and he says if you look at the research, they really don't make a difference. Almost everybody's body produces enough vitamin D without any need at all for a supplement. He's found that there are a lot of claims of genetic links, that if you have a variant gene, you're at an elevated risk of this or that medical condition, and he says those in particular, the negative findings are suppressed because a lot of those genetic findings are from kind of the early days of research in that area where a positive finding was a career maker. And so he says that we have these really mistaken beliefs about the link between a gene and a lot of medical conditions. And finally, he says that this problem plagues a lot of our epidemiological findings about everyday habits. And so people think that if they drink coffee, that they're at elevated risk of, say, pancreatic cancer, and these perceptions are inflated because of this particular problem. Sharon Begley wrote an article about John Ioannidis' critique in an issue of Newsweek in January 2011, and she titled it "Medicine is Wrong About Everything." And it's a good place to start because she's got this very easy to read, very digestible overview of what his claims are and how sweeping they are. And I think if you could get a hold of that article and get a hold of a few others and some of his own writings, you could have a really, really powerful, informative speech that could move a lot of your judges to revisit a lot of things that they think about medicine. And it's certainly been my experience in coaching forensics that medical topics do quite well in informative speech settings just because people think of that information as very, very tightly connected to their own well-being. And so if they have to play tiebreaker between your speech topic and another speech topic, yours may seem more immediately important to them if it helps them put into context, put into perspective what their doctor is telling them. A second possibility for an informative speech topic would be to give a speech on cognitive science and how we can understand cognitive science better through magic. Now, a couple of ways to go about researching this. You could look for work by Gustav Kuhn and Michael Land, and you could look for a particular publication, New Horizons in the Neuroscience of Consciousness. Now, what Kuhn and Land have been up to is they say that there are quirks, there are variants on inattentional blindness, there are blind spots that people have built in just because of the way their brain is structured, and you can demonstrate those. You can see them in action with just simple examples of stage magic. And I always thought that would make a great speech in just about any event where it's expected that you'll have visual aids, because you could bring along, you could learn a little sleight of hand trick like making a quarter disappear and do it in the middle of the speech, and then walk the judge through what just happened and explain your attention flickered here because of the way your brain is built. Now think about the coolness factor in a moment like that happening within a speech. So Gustav Kuhn, Michael Land, the New Horizons in the Neuroscience of Consciousness, get up to speed on what they're finding and put that together in an informative speech with the use of those props in the middle of the speech and possibly more than one trick, and I think that could be really competitive, really memorable. A couple of ideas for persuasive speeches. There's a new book that's a good starting point. It's by an author named Taylor Clark, and the book is Nerve, Poise Under Pressure, and the title goes on a little bit further. But the argument that Clark makes in this book is that stress, just general physical and emotional stress, in the United States in particular, is at a historic high and sweeping upward. And people tend to arrive at immediate explanations for it. They tend to say that it's something like, oh, the bad job market is what's causing stress. Oh, it's the recent natural disasters. It's the threat of terrorism. But Clark makes a pretty compelling argument that there are long-term explanations for this, and there are three of them. And I can just see this falling into a good persuasive speech right away. Those three explanations are, first of all, that we've lost social capital. Now, the loss of social capital refers to, we're pretty sure today that the average adult in the United States has a lot fewer close friends than an average adult in the United States would have had about a generation ago, 20, 25, 30 years ago. In 1990, a sociologist by the name of Robert Putnam put out a book called Bowling Alone, and there have been a couple of people who've updated the same thesis. They say that it used to be communities were very cohesive, and most people would belong to something like a bowling league or a lodge or something like that. But in 1990, if you go out bowling by yourself or you go out bowling with your immediate family. And there have been surveys done that have shown that back in, say, the 70s, the 60s, the 50s, if you ask the average adult, how many close friends do you have that you can tell absolutely anything to, they would say back then that they had 2 or 3. Whereas on average, today, they'll say they have 1. And the average over large populations is even less than 1, because a lot of people will say, I don't have any friends like that. So factor number 1 is the loss of close, supportive relationships. Factor number 2, in Clark's argument, is the overload of data, the internet revolution, having emails and texts and tweets coming in constantly and just being barraged under it and trying to keep up through the day. And that the third factor explaining the long-term increase in stress is that we have an attitude that we're not allowed to have bad feelings. We overreact to feelings of stress. We feel like we have to resolve them and we have to feel better, and we're not good at simply letting stressful times in our lives run their course. Telling ourselves, it's normal, it's okay, I can function under this, I need to do a few simple things to help myself function, but it's not the end of the world if I feel stress building up. And so it seems to me as though you could take some of Clark's research and take some supplemental research and make the case that Americans really are too stressed out. And you can find research about heart disease and blood pressure, about sleep deprivation, about workplace violence, and you could cite all of that. In a second main point, get to what the root causes are and explain them in kind of the vivid way that they're put together in this argument. And then in the last main point, talk about some simple solutions. How can you, for a certain part of each day or each week, cut yourself off from the barrage of data? How can you make an extra effort to go out and make friends and have regular outside contact? And simplest of all, just tell yourself that feeling some stress is normal, that you're not a bad person if you aren't maintaining feelings of happiness all the time, that stress can run its course. I think that could be a really, really effective persuasive speech. And the last idea that I'll share with you, and I guess I was dimly aware of this, I've run across it a couple of times in debate over the years, but it surprises a lot of people to find out that of all the rights that are guaranteed in the United States Constitution, we are not anywhere guaranteed the right to vote. Now, the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment both say that voting cannot be denied in a discriminatory fashion, and I think the 26th Amendment, one of the later amendments, says that you can't deny it to anybody who's over the age of 18 in a discriminatory fashion. But there's no there's no provision in the Constitution that says all citizens who are over the age of 18 have the right to vote. And what's interesting about this is we are one of only 11 democracies on earth that does not enshrine that in the federal Constitution. The effect of that is that elections are handled in very variable ways from state to state. Whereas if there was a federal constitutional right to vote, then that would have to be handled in a much more uniform fashion. And there are people who make the argument that, we've had a lot of mix-ups and confusion and poorly handled elections over the years. There are a lot of people who will make the argument that one of the best solutions for that would be a federal constitutional right to vote so that we would have a uniform standard and uniform procedures. So if you were to pursue that, just go looking for constitutional right to vote. You'll have a whole literature come up, and you could start at the beginning of the speech just by shocking your judge. And I think a lot of the time it really would come as a shock to the judge that the right to vote is not guaranteed in the Constitution, and then go from there into some of the more mundane reasons, some of the pragmatic reasons that if it were in the Constitution it'd be a good idea and things would run more smoothly. But then at the end of the speech, I think, just come back to that. How did you feel at the beginning of my speech when I told you the Constitution doesn't guarantee our right to vote? And that could become your appeal at the end. Even if I'm wrong about everything else about the pragmatics of running elections, if we're going to have all these other rights protected but not that one, does that really make sense to you? So those are some ideas you can check out, and ideally something fruitful will come out of one or more of them, and good luck with your season.